So, imagine walking into your adult Sunday school class, standing at the front of the room and telling your students that their spiritual duty is to submit to a political ruler who actively wants them dead.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds absolutely wild to our modern ears, right?
Mhm.
But that is exactly what the Apostle Peter was
Yeah.
doing. When he wrote to the early church, he was literally instructing them to honor Emperor Nero.
Which is just, it's crazy. But anyway, welcome to the deep dive. We're doing something a bit different today. Consider this a mentor style audio prep session designed specifically for you, the Sunday school teacher.
Right.
We're looking ahead to your April 12th lesson. It's titled Authority Belonging to God. And look, you're tackling the intersection of faith and government, which, let's be honest, is a topic that brings a lot of heat,
Yeah.
a lot of personal opinions into the classroom.
Oh, definitely.
So we've gathered your lesson commentary, some historical data, and the core scripture texts from Mark, Romans, and First Peter.
Yeah, and the real goal for your class this week, it's a heavy one. I mean, we want to help your adult learners navigate this historically intense topic, but the main objective is to shift their perspective.
Okay, shift it how?
Well, we want to help them reframe the conversation away from modern political allegiance and toward divine obedience, to really show them that Christians submit to earthly authority for the Lord's sake.
Got it. But, okay, understanding Nero is great for us, but how does a teacher actually get a room full of, tired adults on a Sunday morning to care about first century Roman politics? I mean, how do you get them out of their modern heads?
That's the challenge, right? You
Yeah.
really have to paint a vivid picture of the world these verses were born into. So when we read the letters of Romans and First Peter, which we often call epistles,
Right.
well, we're largely talking about the mid-first century. This is during the reign of Emperor Nero. And first century Christians, they had absolutely zero legal protections.
Wow. So, like, there were no voting booths, no local town halls to complain at, no petitions to sign.
Nothing. Nothing of the sort. In fact, the hostility was so severe that Peter actually uses a code word in his letter just to keep his readers safe.
Wait, really? A code word?
Yeah. He sends greetings from the church in Babylon. Now, his Jewish and Christian readers, they immediately understood that Babylon was a culturally understood stand-in for Rome
Ah,
because it represented a place of deep decadence, idolatry, and basically ultimate opposition to God. He also addresses his readers as exiles.
right. Reminding them where their true home is.
Exactly. He's deliberately reminding them that their primary citizenship is in God's kingdom, not this earthly empire they just happen to be surviving in.
Man, the hostility is very real then. Which, honestly, it makes the interaction we see in Mark chapter 12 make a little more sense to me. But I'm still a bit stuck on why this specific moment is the anchor for your lesson.
Well, which part?
The part where Jesus is asked a question about paying taxes. Because on the surface, it just looks like a mundane financial question, right?
Hmm.
Why is this such a pivotal, dangerous moment?
Ah, well, because it's a beautifully constructed deadly trap.
A trap.
Yes. You have these two distinct groups approaching Jesus in the temple courtyard.
Hmm?
Right. The Pharisees and the Herodians.
Wait, hold on. My understanding is that those two groups absolutely despised each other.
Oh, they did. They completely hated each other.
Mm.
I mean, the Pharisees were strict religious leaders who viewed the Roman occupation as a deeply offensive affront to God.
Right.
The Herodians, on the other hand, well, they were a political faction whose power and wealth came directly from Rome. They were essentially Rome's lackeys.
Ah, I see. So the enemy of my enemy is my friend. They team up to get Jesus out of the picture.
Precisely. So they approach him right in front of this massive crowd, and they ask, is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not?
Oof. And I assume if he says yes, he totally loses the crowd.
Right. If he says yes, pay the tax, the Pharisees can immediately turn to the Jewish crowd and shout, look, this guy supports our pagan oppressors. He violates the law of Moses. He's a traitor.
And Jesus loses all of his spiritual credibility with the people.
Exactly.
But if he says no, do not pay the tax.
Then the Herodians are standing right there. They're ready to signal the Roman guards to arrest him for sedition and treason against the emperor. It seems like an inescapable checkmate.
Wow. So how does he maneuver out of that? Because he obviously does.
He asks for a denarius. That's the specific Roman coin used to pay the tax.
Yeah.
He holds it up and he asks the crowd, whose image is this? And whose inscription?
And the answer, Caesar's.
Right. And here is the vital context your class really needs to grasp. That coin was deeply offensive to a Jewish person. It featured the face of Tiberius Caesar and an inscription calling him the son of the divine.
Oh, wow. So it was a graven image.
Exactly, a blatant piece of idolatry.
So he holds up this idolatrous coin right in the middle of the temple.
Yep. And Jesus delivers this legendary pivot. He says, "Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's."
Man, I see the genius in that now. Because he's acknowledging that, Caesar stamped his face on this piece of metal, so fine, give him his metal back. Pay for the roads and the aqueducts.
Right, exactly.
But what is stamped with God's image? We are. Humanity is made in the image of God.
That's the crux of it. So while we might owe a government our civic taxes, we owe God our entire being, our honor, our worship, our ultimate obedience.
Jesus completely disarms the trap by showing that Caesar is just a temporary ruler, right? He's not a deity.
Exactly. And that distinction is just huge for a teacher to make in class.
Okay, so moving from Jesus in Mark 12 to the letters written by Paul and Peter decades later, the hostility from Rome is even worse by then, right?
Oh, much worse.
Yet Paul writes in Romans chapter 13 that everyone should be, quote, subject to the governing authorities. I mean, how is he justifying that command while believers are literally being persecuted?
Well, Paul is arguing from the standpoint of cosmic design. Romans 13 states there's no authority except that which God has established.
Okay, but what does subject to actually mean there?
The Greek concept for being subject to literally means to be rank under another. Paul is teaching that the position of authority is part of God's architectural design for the world, to maintain peace and punish wrong behavior.
Even when the human occupying that position is flawed.
Yes, even when they're deeply flawed.
I want to pause on that because that is going to be a massive hurdle for a modern class.
Oh, absolutely.
People look at the chaos of politics, the corruption of certain leaders, and they think, God cannot possibly be endorsing this person.
Right.
The lesson commentary actually mentions a story about an English class where the teacher sat in the back of the room and let the students argue over who was in charge, just to prove that the real teacher was still ultimately the authority in the room.
I love that story.
It's good, but I feel like we need to push that analogy further for the teacher to explain the actual mechanism of how this works.
Let's push it then.
Yeah.
How would you frame the mechanism for your students?
Well, think of it like a franchise owner and a corporate CEO. The CEO of a massive restaurant chain delegates authority to a local franchise owner to run the day-to-day operations, right?
Okay, tracking with you.
The franchise owner has real power in that building. I mean, they hire, they fire, they set schedules, but they only possess that power because the CEO granted it to them.
Right.
And if the franchise owner goes rogue and starts violating the corporate charter, the CEO still holds the ultimate authority to step in and handle it. So God is the CEO. Earthly rulers are just middle management.
That is a brilliant way to explain it. It really separates the office from the individual.
Yeah.
We respect the delegated authority because we respect the CEO who designed the system of order.
Yeah, exactly.
The commentary actually mentions how international students from Africa will often address an instructor simply as "teacher." They show immense respect for the title, regardless of the individual holding it.
That makes perfect sense.
When we conceptualize authority as originating from God's design, we can honor the position.
Which ties perfectly into what Peter writes in 1 Peter chapter 2. He tells the believers to submit to every human authority for the Lord's sake.
Right.
But then he gives a very specific reason in verse 15. He says, "It is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people."
Yes. Theologians sometimes refer to this as an apologetic of action.
Okay, let's break that jargon down. Apologetic of action. So essentially, Peter is saying their good behavior in the community was their best defense attorney.
That's a great way to put it.
Like their actions argued their case better than words ever could.
That is exactly right. Early Christians were victims of these wild, dangerous rumors. Because they refused to participate in the worship of Roman gods, they were branded as atheists.
Which is so ironic.
Right. And because they placed allegiance to a new king, Jesus, they were accused of plotting violent rebellion. So Peter's telling them that the best way to dismantle these deadly rumors is to be overwhelmingly good citizens.
Just pay your taxes, honor the king, do tangible good in the community.
Yes. It makes the accusations of sedition look utterly ridiculous to any outside observer.
All right, let's look at the reality of teaching this on a Sunday morning. Because if a teacher presents Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2 without any caveats, hands are going to shoot up.
Oh yeah, count on it.
Someone's going to say, wait, what if the government tells us to do something sinful? Are we supposed to just blindly obey a tyrant?
And the teacher absolutely must be ready for that curveball. Because the biblical text does not teach blanket submission to tyranny.
Okay, so where do we point them?
You want to point your class directly to Acts chapter 5. Peter and the other apostles are brought before the religious ruling council, and they are strictly ordered to stop teaching in the name of Jesus.
That's a direct, clear command from the governing authorities.
Right. And Peter's response, in verse 29, provides the crucial counterbalance to Romans 13. He looks at the council and declares, we must obey God rather than human beings.
Wow. Okay, so how does a teacher explain where the line is? Because, I personally disagree with this law is a very different statement from this law violates God's command.
That's the key distinction. You have to provide the class with a clear rule of thumb, and it's this. Our submission to human authority is genuine, but it is not absolute.
Okay.
The moment an earthly directive forces you to violate a heavenly directive, the earthly directive loses all its power.
So if a government commands you to harm your neighbor or forbids you from gathering to worship, God's law overrides middle management.
Exactly. Remember, the same Apostle Paul who wrote Romans 13 was repeatedly beaten and thrown in Roman prisons because he absolutely refused to stop doing what God commanded him to do.
That tension is so real. I see the lesson material provides a sort of framework to help adults navigate this, like a spectrum of behavior.
Yeah, it's a very helpful visual.
Can you walk us through that spectrum?
Gladly. So ask your class to imagine a continuum line. On the far left end of the spectrum, you have legalism.
Legalism, okay.
This is a rigid, inflexible obsession with rule-keeping. It's this false belief that checking every box and following every minor human law to the letter makes you spiritually superior.
Okay, got it. And on the opposite end of the spectrum?
On the far right end is license. This is taking the beautiful concept of Christian freedom and using it as an excuse to do whatever you want.
Right. The classic, I'm a citizen of heaven, so I don't have to follow local zoning laws for the church building argument.
Precisely. It is anarchy disguised as spirituality. Peter actually actively warns against this in his letter. He says believers must never use their freedom as a cover-up for evil.
So where should we be aiming?
The biblical middle ground between legalism and license is what we call liberty. Liberty means you live as a free person, but you willingly choose to submit to earthly authorities as a way to serve and honor God.
You use your freedom to be a blessing to your community, not a burden.
Exactly right.
I want to inject a quick tip here for the teacher navigating the room, because when you start talking about corrupt leaders and bad laws, your class is instantly going to think of modern politics.
Oh, within seconds.
You might get comments taking shots at the left. You might get comments taking shots at the right. How do you keep the class from just, devolving into a cable news debate?
You have to anchor them to the text. The moment the conversation drifts into a debate about a specific modern policy or politician, validate their passion, but gently steer them back to first-century Rome.
So remind them of the context.
Right. Remind them that while believers in Western democracies have the profound blessing of due process and voting, which are tools the early church did not possess, by the way, our core mandate remains the same as theirs.
Which is?
We're not gathering to endorse a partisan side. We are gathering to learn how to reflect the character of God.
I love that. Okay, let's talk practical application now. We need to give our teachers a concrete battle plan. How do they actually structure this 45 to 60-minute block?
Well, the goal is to move the room from an engaging opening into the biblical text and finally into personal application.
Okay, so how do we start?
A highly effective way to start, to get them, into the lesson, is a whiteboard activity. Draw a horizontal line across the board, write adversary on one side and friend on the other.
Okay.
Then ask the class to come up and place their initials on the line based on their gut reaction to the word government.
Oh, that immediately breaks the ice. And I imagine you'll see initials scattered all over the board.
Oh, you definitely will. And you can simply ask a few people to share why they put their initials where they did. It gets the adults thinking about the dual nature of civil authority, how it protects us, but how it can also deeply frustrate us.
That's really smart. And then you transition into the word, getting them into Mark, Romans, and 1 Peter. But instead of just lecturing at them for 20 minutes, how do we get them actually interacting with the material?
Divide them into small groups, hand out the passages, and task them with writing 2 standards of conduct lists based strictly on what they just read.
What are the 2 lists?
One list detailing what God expects from governing officials, and one list detailing what God expects from citizens.
Oh, I like that. That forces them to actually dig into the text themselves.
Exactly.
But once they've done that, the teacher has to guide the broader discussion. Let's talk through a few of the big concepts they need to cover. And more importantly, how to guide the answers. Because look, I know if I asked a room full of adults, do you consider paying taxes a part of your spiritual integrity? I am just going to get groans about the IRS.
Oh, 100%. And you should expect those groans. But as the teacher, your job is to guide them past that financial frustration.
So how do I do that?
When they complain, acknowledge it. Note that the tax collectors in the first century were notoriously corrupt extortionists. I mean, the financial burden was genuinely worse back then.
That puts it in perspective.
Right. But then bring them back to Paul's core argument in Romans 13. Paying taxes is an act of spiritual obedience. It's a moral obligation to support the civic order God established, even if the system itself is incredibly flawed.
Got it. Now, what happens when you get to the rebellion question? You ask the class, when is it appropriate to go against earthly authority? And someone brings up a personal grievance, like a local ordinance they think is unfair.
This is exactly where you test their understanding of Acts 5. If their example is just about personal inconvenience or a political disagreement, you have to kindly challenge that premise.
So you ask them directly.
Yeah. Ask the room, does this example force a believer to directly violate a command of God? Make sure they understand the high bar set by the early church. The conflict has to be undeniable.
What about bringing it closer to home? How do we make this intensely personal for the class before they leave?
Ask them this question. If you and your church were suddenly removed from your community tomorrow, would you be missed?
Oof, that is a heavy, convicting question.
It's meant to be. It gets right to the heart of Peter's apologetic of action. If the class struggles to answer it, prompt them to look at their tangible footprint.
What?
Like, are we feeding the hungry in our city? Are we serving the local schools? Do we care for the vulnerable? If the church vanished tomorrow and the neighborhood didn't even notice, well, then we aren't modeling the kind of civic presence Peter is talking about.
Wow. Yeah, our presence in the city should be an undeniable blessing.
Exactly.
That is the exact kind of self-reflection you want happening in a Sunday school class. So to close out the session, how should a teacher land the plane?
Bring the room back to a posture of humility. Go back to that whiteboard and ask the class to brainstorm the names of local, regional, and national leaders. The mayor, the school board president, the governor, the president, write them all down.
Okay.
Then pair everyone up and have them spend the last few minutes praying specifically for those leaders.
And not praying that they lose the next election, I assume?
No. Praying for them to have wisdom, to act justly, and praying that the believers in the community would know how to live peaceably and honorably under their leadership.
What a powerful way to end the hour. To the teacher listening right now, you are completely ready for this. You have the historical backdrop of Nero's Rome to set the scene.
We really have to.
You have the CEO and franchise owner analogy to explain the mechanics of delegated authority. And you know how to navigate the tension between civic obedience and obeying God first. You are totally set up to lead a transformative discussion.
Absolutely. And if you need one concise sentence to just write on the board as your final wrap-up, use this. Christians submit to earthly authority for the Lord's sake because all authority ultimately belongs to God.
A perfect anchor for the class. But before we sign off and let you finalize your prep for Sunday, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over for yourself.
Let's hear it.
We spent a lot of time today talking about boundaries, rules, and navigating government. But in Romans 13, right after Paul finishes his argument about paying taxes and giving honor to whom honor is due, he shifts gears completely.
It really does.
In verse 8, he writes that the only debt we should leave outstanding is the continuing debt to love one another. If the early church changed the entire landscape of the Roman Empire, not through political revolution, but through a radical, submissive love, how might a relentless focus on our debt to love reshape our own communities faster than any ballot box ever could?